So welcome everybody to the CUDAN Open Lab Seminar on March 7, 2022. Today our guest is Arianna Salazar Miranda from the Sensible City Lab at MIT, where she's a PhD student, but she has done a lot of work. And she will speak about urban analytics and city design. So if I'm rightly informed, the idea is she will speak about for 45 minutes, and then afterwards we will have a neat discussion. So, Arianna, the stage is yours.
Sounds good. Thank you for inviting me. And again, I apologize for the time zone confusion, but anyway, we're here. So let me talk to you about urban analytics and city design. So the work that I'll present today focuses on exactly that, how we can sort of leverage all of these new technologies to study cities. And I'll begin by just giving you a brief introduction to MIT and the Sensible City Lab, where all this takes place. So let me make sure that. All right, so this is MIT for those of you that haven't seen it. And this is how it looks from above. So as you can see, it's sort of an ecosystem of different disciplines working all together. And building 9, which you can see in the logo in white, thus MIT, is where Sensible City is located. And Sensible City brings together people from all around the world, people from diverse backgrounds, cultures, and disciplines. So you think of mathematicians, physicists, computer scientists, architects, urban planners, all different disciplines working together. And really what brings us together is an interest to understand how the cities of the future can be transformed by digital technologies. And of course, cities are different around the world, right? And that's why the research we do takes place both at the lab and outside of it. So we partner with cities around the world hand in hand and work on the important issues that they face. And you might be wondering, why do we even study cities? And the reason is quite simple. So cities occupy 2% of the land, 50% of the global population, which consume 75% of the energy and produce 80% of the CO2 emissions. So really the great challenges of humanity, we're gonna make them or break them in cities. And throughout history, cities have been key spaces to facilitate exchange between people. Today, access to data is making us more and more connected. And we're both more connected to objects, but also amongst ourselves. So what does this technological revolution mean for cities? And at Sensible City Lab, we try to understand these technological possibilities by combining research and design. And this doesn't just happen in a lab in front of our computer. We prototype, we build sensors, and we test everything that we design. So for example, at the top left, you see a sensor to measure the structural health of buildings. At the top right, we're testing a rowboat that goes down into the sewers to analyze viruses and bacteria that are excreted and collected into the sewers. And immediately down in the picture, you can also see rowboat, which is a prototype of an autonomous boat that can turn into floating bridges and a waste collector. A very important part of our work is how do we get people involved? So of course, we're interested in publishing our research, but a critical part of what we do is how we engage with the general public in the research that we do in order to generate sort of a broader debate around the issues that we research. So today I will introduce 3 projects that focus on using artificial intelligence or AI methods, such as computer vision and machine learning to study urban environments. So first, I'll talk about desirable streets, which uses GPS data and computer vision to understand what makes streets attractive for pedestrians. Then I'll talk about Paris flows, which is an ongoing project where we use sensors to understand how streets are used in real time. And then finally, I will also introduce a project that we launched recently, which is Favelas 4D, which uses LiDAR data to analyze the morphology of informal settlements. So in desirable streets, we're interested in understanding what characteristics of the built environment attract pedestrians. And this is an important question for several reasons. So first, streets are a critical public space for economic and social exchange. What happens in streets is a big part of what makes cities unique. Second, cities are investing vast amounts of resources in improving the quality of their streets. And this is in part motivated by the conviction that well-designed streets will in fact improve the citizens' quality of life. And finally, understanding how people use streets is a needed step if we want to design better guidelines and interventions that can lead to actually us designing streets that are more lively. So for example, cities like New York and Boston are already implementing ambitious plans to improve street life. So in Boston, these plans are part of the Go Boston 2030 capital strategy. And similarly, in New York, the plan is part of the NYC DOT initiative, which aims to develop measures to evaluate street projects. So a first step to understand the life of streets is to study where people walk. So imagine someone walking from point A to point B. Usually, we would expect people to take the shortest path, which I'm showing with a black line. And while this is mostly true, it is also the case that more than 20% of the people deviate from the shortest route. In these cases, pedestrians are willing to endure longer commutes to enjoy desirable places and avoid undesirable ones. So in this project, we study what makes a street desirable, in the sense that thousands of pedestrians are willing to systematically deviate from the shortest routes to visit it. So do desirable streets have particular design features? Are they bursting with amenities and shops? Do they have better access to green space and sidewalks? And if so, how important are all of these factors in determining a street's desirability? So we measure the desirability of streets using GPS data by counting the total number of pedestrians that deviate from the shortest path to visit it. The desirability index is going to be high for streets that are the route of choice of many pedestrians, even when they're not in the shortest path. Conversely, the desirability index is low for streets that pedestrians avoid, even if they are in the shortest path. So conceptually, this measure captures the willingness of pedestrians to deviate from the shortest path, revealing how much they value a given street over another. You can sort of think of this as a measure of the scenic or the experience value that different parts of the city provide. So for example, streets near Harvard Square that I'm showing in the image have a high desirability because we see pedestrians deviating from the black shortest line to visit them. This map shows the most desirable streets, which we computed from thousands of pedestrian trips in Boston from the GPS data. So as you can see from the map, desirable streets are dispersed throughout the city. For example, they're found close to the city center, but they're also very frequent as we move outskirts of the city, along corridors that connect the main city with towns. And this observation is important because it means that the desirability is not capturing only global characteristics of the city, such as the density, the location, proximity to transit stops, and other attributes of the street network. Instead, the desirability index provides meaningful and very local information on the streets in each block that are thriving and the ones that are being systematically avoided and could be a potential target for interventions. So for example, these figures zoom in on 2 selected neighborhoods and illustrate the large local variation in street desirability. So now that we know which streets are the most desirable and where they're located, we can turn to investigate what features they have in common. And so to do this, we use images from Google Street View paired with computer vision techniques to measure a diverse set of built environment characteristics. And we focus on those characteristics that urban planners have long believed to be associated with a pedestrian's experience while walking. So think of the location of businesses, parks, urban furniture, sidewalks, and visual enclosure. So the video that I just showed shows the Google Street View images along the path taken by pedestrians and the shortest path between its origin and destination. And you could also see how our computer vision algorithms worked. So it detects the presence of street characteristics and draws a bounding box around them. So this map illustrates our first finding. By comparing street segments with different levels of desirability, we find that desirable streets tend to have neighboring parks. And in particular, a park increases the number of pedestrians that visit it by more than 11%. We also provide evidence showing that businesses are an important dimension of a street's desirability. One additional business establishment, and such as a restaurant, a pub, or a store, increases desirability by 2%. We also find that the variety of businesses is more important than their sheer number to predict the street desirability. And this provides some support for the long-held view by urbanists, suggesting that mixed uses and variety of land uses play an important role in making streets lively. Also, desirable streets tend to have better infrastructure, including sidewalks, benches, chairs, and even trash bins. And finally, beyond urban infrastructure and amenities, we also find an important role for the aesthetic qualities of urban design that influence pedestrians' experience while walking. So in particular, desirable streets tend to be more visually enclosed and have more homogeneous facades. So think of streets that are perfectly framed by surrounding buildings and that use common materials and share a similar design. The desirability measure provides practical value for urban planners, or that's our hope. For example, it can be used to identify areas with high potential to attract pedestrians that currently have low desirability and would be good candidates to intervene or to retrofit. And likewise, the desirability index can be used to identify areas with high desirability that can teach practitioners lessons about good urban design. And finally, we also envision that desirability maps could be beneficial if they're produced over time to track how changes to the built environment might affect the trajectories that pedestrians take throughout the city. So despite the fact that streets are key to cities, because I've showed you that they contribute to social life, but we know that they also contribute to social interactions, to business activity, we still lack consistent ways to measure how people use streets beyond just where people walk. And this is going to be the focus of the second project, which is Paris Flows. So some of you might be familiar with this image. This is William White, one of the pioneers on the study of urban space. And what he's doing is he's manually recording how people use streets based on his observations, and if he's lucky, based on a couple of surveys. And so this is a tradition.
Sorry to interrupt here. What's your policy for replying to the question is that at the end of the talk or in between switching from one project?
We discuss at the end, sorry.
Okay, okay.
Sorry.
Sounds good. So the traditional approach that I was saying is the way we've typically and historically used to investigate how people are experiencing the city. And although we agree that this approach is very rich, it's also very local and very difficult to scale. So in this project, our goal is to develop a methodology to gather data on human activity that captures both its intensity and type, and that can be deployed for whole cities. So better understanding street use is particularly relevant now that we're witnessing a surge in demand for street space from micromobility modes like scooters, bicycles, and even private delivery companies. So how did we do this? We partner with RATP, which is a state-owned public transport operator that manages the largest bus fleet in Paris. And our approach works in the following way. First, we equipped RATP buses with a camera that captures real-time images of Parisian streets. Then we use machine learning and computer vision techniques to process these images and classify them depending on how people are using space. For example, we can distinguish between a person walking by from a person sitting in a terrace or waiting for the bus to come. Importantly, our algorithms conduct the classification locally in the sensor, which means that we do not store nor retain any of the images. And this allows us to obtain a rich set of metrics on how people are using streets, while at the same time respecting individual privacy. So let me start by describing how we classify human activity by using computer vision and machine learning techniques. So before our deployment, we developed and tested our computer vision model using Google Street View images from Paris, like the one I'm showing you in the screen. And we collected a total of 2,000 images that covered the whole city and trained our algorithm to go through these images and recognize both human activities and transportation modes. So this is how the output of the algorithm looks like in practice. Our model can recognize up to 30 categories of human activity and transportation. So here, for example, I'm showing how it detects a range of activities, which I'm showing in different colors, from people walking or standing, and also we can distinguish between cars, vans, and different modes of transportation. Here are more examples of the model detection. So as you can see, our model can go as far as to recognize if people are sitting in groups, as well as distinguish micromobility like scooters, including scooters that are not being in use, and motorbikes and bicycles. And again, let me emphasize that all the details that you see in these images are not saved as part of our data. So instead, we only keep account of the different activities detected in each street, in each point in time, so that this image now looks more like this data set, where you're summarizing all the activities into a couple of data points. So now that we know how the classification of activities work, let's switch gears to the hardware that we use to collect the images in real time. So let me introduce you to the frog. The frog is a 20 by 10 centimeter sensor with a camera that can be placed in moving vehicles. So the frog is capable of capturing real-time images of its surroundings, and it then locally analyzes the data and stores timestamped and geocoded data on everything that it detects. So we've mounted the sensors on one bus line and collected data for 4 weeks during May 2021. So the two pictures on the far left show the placement of the camera on the front of the bus, and then the rest show some of the information that we provided to bus users that explained how the project worked, the extent, the goals, basically made sort of a description of the project available for the passengers riding the bus. So the streets shown in red depict the route where the bus collected images. And we selected this bus line to collect the data because as you can see, it crosses Paris from west to east and covers a large portion of the city. So the bus also passes through main streets that are close to the river, but also goes through commercial and residential areas towards the south. So basically this line, which if you're familiar with the Parisian context, is line 70. It's sort of our guarantee that the bus was covering a wide range of different places, as well as the majority of the extent of the city. Of course, we can argue that like it's obviously not representative of the Parisian context. It's one bus line, but you know, it's the best we could do. So in total, the bus route covered around 6,400 street segments all together. So this is how the data looks like if we zoom in. So each dot represents a picture and a series of activities that it detects. So with the data we collected, we've started to identify patterns across different activities that happen throughout the day. So for example, in this diagram, we can easily see that most activities peak between 4 and 7, and also that the two most prominent activities are, of course, cars, but then also passersby. And most importantly, we can also distinguish between people passing by from stayers. And I haven't touched a lot about this, and we can obviously discuss it more in the Q&A, but urbanists place a lot of value in distinguishing between passersby and stayers because they sort of tell us about the quality of the built environment, right? It's not the same to have a street where people are reading or sitting or having a coffee than just a street that connects 2 points where you see a lot of people just passing by. So the idea behind these two metrics is that they will provide sort of, will tell us a little bit more about the types of environments that we have in the city. So we can also explore the performance of specific streets and see how they fare in terms of cars, passersby, and stayers. And so here, the darker red square indicates a higher number per hour of the day. So for example, the plot on the left shows the average number of cars per hour in selected streets. And you can see in dark red, the streets with the highest car usage. And we can also compare streets in terms of their human activity. So for example, in the plot in the center, I'm showing that Road Saint-Michel holds the most passersby in the afternoon, and that roads like Place Bourdon, which also has the most cars, also hold among the lowest number of passersby. So it's almost like in many of these streets, there is almost like an inverse pattern where you have many number of cars sort of are a disamenity or negative externality on pedestrians, and you see a lower number of pedestrians in those streets as well, which makes sense because of noise pollution, air pollution in general, and things like that. And so finally, the plot on the far left shows that the streets that attract more stayers throughout the day is Saint-Sulpice. And altogether, this information allows us to study how the different uses for each street vary throughout the day. And so we're hopeful that this information can also help the city identify, and I'll speak about a little bit more about this later, but what areas to pedestrianize, which is sort of something that they have on their mind these days. So our ultimate goal is to create a measure of street activity and uses in real time for all streets. And as I was briefly saying before, I'm sure you can already start imagining where understanding patterns of street activity can be useful. So one practical area where I think this measure could be particularly relevant is to help us evaluate the success of street interventions. So for example, what is the effect of pedestrianizing a street on human activity? The map here shows a staggered policies that impose an upper speed limit on vehicles in several parts of the city over time. So this is an initiative that was part of the sort of meeting areas initiative that started a little bit before 2010 and has been ongoing in the city. And the idea is that the areas that you see in color in the map correspond to slow zones, or areas where traffic is restricted to a maximum of 30 kilometers per hour. And so currently, the city has very limited ways to measure the effect of such interventions. And the effect of, for example, part of the goal was to create streets that were more lively. And so are these areas sort of achieving that goal? So our measure can be useful for them to understand the short-term impacts of pedestrianizing, but also because the data are collected continuously, it can also be useful to evaluate their long-term impacts. So for example, do the changes we see in pedestrian behavior and activity more broadly persist long after these places are intervened? This is a topic that we're currently exploring. And so in the interest of time, I won't go into the particular details of this intervention, but happy to chat more about this in the Q&A if someone is interested. So in the last project, I want to showcase how new technologies can be used in the context of developing countries to better understand informal settlements. So our motivation for this project is that out of the 4 billion people who live in cities worldwide, about 1 billion live in informal settlements. Informal settlements are typically constructed outside of the regulations of official cities. And this is important because it means that these places are typically very, very dense and also characterized by irregular built environments, which make it difficult to study them using traditional methods. So for example, these areas are impenetrable from satellite view because they're very, very dense. In addition, its narrow and curvilinear streets also impose a limit to the coverage of the images that can be collected at the street level. So just to give you an example, in Rocinha, which is one of the largest informal settlements that are also known as favelas in Brazil, we estimated that only 23% of all the streets can be accessed with a Google Street View car. So in summary, despite their global importance, informal settlements are very difficult to analyze and study at scale because we lack data on them. So in this project, we use LiDAR to characterize the morphology of informal settlements. And for those of you who are not familiar with LiDAR, it's a technology that provides a full 3D scan of a place. And we use it to develop comprehensive measures of the built environment, of the topography, and the location and the height of all the buildings. And we focus on morphology because it's a productive lens to study informal settlements. And in particular, it's a very good angle to study them because it gives us information on the shape of the built environment, which in a sense also reveals the complexity of development and allows us to study some of the many issues that are faced by them. So you can think here about crowding, about structural risk and accessibility, which all of them are deeply linked to the configuration or the built environment itself. Moreover, characterizing the morphology of informal settlements hopefully can also help us inform urban design interventions or help us inform policies to alleviate some of the negative impacts of living in these settlements. So now I'll show you how we are at the lab using LiDAR to better understand Rocinha, which, as I mentioned before, is one of the largest favelas in Brazil. So let me start by describing the data that we used for this project. As I briefly mentioned before, LiDAR is a 3D scanning technology that creates a point cloud using laser range measurements. And our LiDAR data was collected by BR Tech, which is a Brazilian 3D scanning firm that conducts scans from the ground by walking the area. And this approach privileges the interior view of the street and provides very rich information on both the streets and the immediate facades that face it. So the scans for this project come from two different areas of the favela that have very distinct morphological qualities. So in the image I'm showing in the upper left corner is the courtyard, which is a wide formalized plaza that was the result of a government intervention in the early 2000s. And then in the bottom right corner is the hillside, which is comprised of a set of built residences, all conglomerated on top of one another as they ascend a public staircase. So combined, they occupy around 500 square meters of land. And here, I just wanted to give you a better sense of how the process of data collection looks like. So this is the LiDAR device. And I think there are two things that I want you to notice. One, how manual the process is. So this is someone that is moving this LiDAR device from one place to another to scan it. But the second thing is for you to notice how narrow the streets of these places are, right? So basically, there is no other way to access it other than walking. And so the 3D LiDAR scans, we can use them to create rich measures that describe the morphology and the built landscape of favelas. And so we compute 5 measures. The first is, first we compute width and street elevation of streets, and both of them have implications for street accessibility. Then we compute the standard deviation of the facade height, which gives us a sense of the diversity of building scales in any given street. Then we have facade density, which represents how many buildings there are per square meter of street space. So you can think of it as a measure of like the crowding that buildings have in each street. And then finally, our measure of street canyon, which is the ratio of maximum facade height to street width. So essentially, this gives us the aspect ratio of the street. And we can use these morphological measures to illuminate differences across streets. So the bar graphs show the morphological profiles of 4 streets that I selected. So for example, street 1 has the highest street width, around 6 meters, and the largest facade height diversity. And this makes sense as it's a large public road with plenty of businesses. Meanwhile, you can see that street 4 has the lowest street width and also the lowest facade height diversity, since it's surrounded by buildings that are all the same height. And these aspects are consistent with the street being sort of a private courtyard and a dead end. And recall that the lidar we used for this analysis comes from 2 separate areas. So the courtyard and the hillside. And so streets 1 and 2, which you see a bounding box around them, are from the courtyard scan, and the remaining streets come from the hillside one. And as I mentioned before, we expect these areas to be morphologically different because that's how they were developed. One was a formalized plaza and the other one was sort of ground up buildings. So we can look into these differences more concretely by comparing their morphological profiles. So for instance, streets 1 and 2 have commonalities that they don't share with streets 3 and 4, such as wider streets, lower facade density, which suggests that the public intervention in the early 2000s managed to curb density and generate wider streets. And this is reassuring because it means that our analysis is capturing the actual morphological variation in the favela according to the history of its development, and is allowing us to explore how public interventions have shaped the favela in a persistent way. We can also go one step further and get a more detailed analysis that exploits all of the richness of the lidar data. And we can do this by zooming in to each street to assess how morphology and the built landscape changes within that street. So for example, the figure in the bottom left panel shows how facade height varies as we walk the street from one end to the other. So following the white center line that I'm showing in the big figure. And the data shows that the street has a cluster of tall buildings at one end, which are between 12 and 14 meters in height, so equivalent to around 5 to 6 floors, and then falls to an average height of 2 meters. And this metric is useful in various contexts. So for example, it can be applied to structural stability analysis, where risk can be correlated to building height, and it can also connect to different population densities and even to the microclimate of that area. We can also map variations in the street canyon, which depend on the overall street width and the facade height. So recall that the street canyon will be the highest where there are very, very tall facades and a very narrow street. And this spatial relationship has implications for the fresh air that can reach the street, but also the amount of sunlight that can reach it. So it's sort of a measure of how any given street is enclosed. And here I'm moving to a different street and tracing its width. And so the figure on the bottom left shows that street width is around 2.5 meters and also identifies some tight areas where the street width falls dramatically, jeopardizing access and creative connecting bottlenecks. So places where we can't access. And one final application that I want to show you is how we can draw high resolution maps of the scanning area to illustrate morphological variation within the favela. So for me, this final step brings our results into the realm of actionability for urban planners, who could use these detailed information to pinpoint hotspots in need of infrastructure or safety improvements. So for example, an overlap of high facade heights and changing elevation values in the same location could suggest possible structural instability. Or the coincidence of narrow street widths and high street canyon values could also indicate poor ventilation. So these maps offer a glimpse of the type of valuable information that will be available when the whole favela is scanned. So our analysis thus far has focused on these two areas of the favela that I outlined, but our goal is to extend this analysis to all of Rocinha and to other informal settlements around the world. And this would allow us to explore the commonalities and the differences in the morphology of informal settlements, which will also help us hopefully identify some of the structural issues that these settlements face. So our approach has the advantage that it allows us to simultaneously measure morphology in very great detail, as I've showed, but it can also be scaled relatively easily to large geographic areas. So we're currently working with partners in Cali, Colombia, to conduct our next scan. So let me conclude here and open it up for questions and comments.
Thank you very much. So
let me stop sharing my screen.
Regular super blast. Yeah, thank you very much. This was great. So we heard about 3 projects, and you can see there is already 2 hands up. I don't know. So we take questions as they come along, but obviously, as everybody else is like sort of like thinking about questions, we had pedestrian desirability, we had Paris flows, and favelas 4D. The first 3 questions may be completely randomized. So the first one was unit Timaitit.
Yes, thanks, Max, and thanks, Arianna, for such an inspiring talk. It's a lot of work that you're doing, and for me, I think it's very important and exciting to see the work that's so applicable, and as you call, so much in the realm of accountability for, let's say, urban planners. Just how much the result that you're actually producing can be used. I myself work with mostly film data on gender diversity. And for me, it is also really important that the work that we do can actually be used in the industry and is actually relevant. But my question is about the first project that you described about desirable and not desirable streets. And I guess being a woman and picking routes, for me, the probably number one matter is safety when choosing how to walk around the city. And that becomes especially important in the evening. So when it becomes dark outside, depending on where you are in the world, I guess. So I was actually wondering whether you looked also at these maps during different times of the day, because you mentioned, for instance, that routes with parks are very attractive, but I might imagine that in the evenings they become much less attractive because of the dangers. And that, I guess, would be the people dangers. But then there are also streets that might be, let's say, very well lit, but they might be quite wide and so have a lot of traffic. So as a pedestrian, I might also not want to choose those streets because of the traffic dangers and rather go for, let's say, narrow streets. So I was just wondering if you looked at this aspect of safety and also if you perhaps looked at these streets during different types of the day and how those routes differ then. Thank you.
Absolutely. So thank you for that question. You touched on like all of them very important points. So the first one is, yes, we did look at different times of the day and different seasons even, right? Because the amount of trees, all of these things change from season to season. And in Boston, that is particularly true. So what I showed you today was the aggregated across all times, but we find a similar pattern for different times of the day and different seasons. So that's the first part. But I think your point about gender is also an important one that sort of this big data approach misses. And in particular, GPS data of the type that we used misses. But this is not to say that like, you know, big data is not useful. On the contrary, I think it's very useful, and paired with other types of knowing, it can even be better, right? So just to give you an example, the GPS data that we used has no personal information. So I don't know anything about your sociodemographics or who you are. The only thing I know is the traces of where you walk. So that's sort of a limitation of how much we can say on other interesting issues like gender. But I'm sure there's like a lot of interesting work where you do survey data or other types. And there has been some evidence that like the way we walk is very different, right? Like across women, male, and even children and things like that. So definitely an important and useful point. Yeah.
I have like just an organizational question to everybody. So should we stick with one project and then go to the next and then go to the next, or should we just take random questions? I know that Tasvir's question is also obviously for project number 1 because you sort of like wanted to ask the question before. So let's stick with number 1 and then let's do the other projects maybe. Tasvir.
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful talk. Actually, I have the 3 questions and 2 questions from the project 1 and 1 question from the project 3. So from the project 1, the first question is regarding the data collection. For example, the data has been collected. It is from the people who are resident of the city or the people who are just come here for tourism or something like that. I explain this in that context. For example, if I am visiting in the Singapore and I am the resident, I am the tourist in the Singapore, then I may go towards walking around the Singapore. I may attracted towards the Little India because it is, and if I am the resident of the Singapore, I will only start my journey from my home or apartment to the office or the whatever the location is. So this kind of thing, it may implicate the concept of attraction or liveliness of the street. So this was the one question. The second question is that you said that you are doing the research to make the streets more lively or more attractive or something like that. I think this as a question of a game theory. When you say that you are making the streets as the less attractive streets as attractive streets, so basically what you are going to do, that you are taking the persons from the lively streets towards the less lively streets, because this is the way that you are actually for the less lively streets, so you are taking the person from the lively streets. You got my point? Because otherwise the people are the same. The 100 people, for example, there are 100 people and 70 people, they visit the lively streets. And for the less lively streets, how the people you will make the less lively streets attractive, and so that the people from the lively streets, 70 people may come towards the less lively streets. So it is a example of a problem of a game theory, or for example, generative adversarial networks, where you have to dodge and where there is a balance of 50-50%. Yeah, so this is like that. So what you say that the project you are doing or research you are conducting for those who are the lively streets. So actually, does it cast a shadow on the liveliness of those streets?
I think so let me answer your second question. I think the point is not to say that we're going to make streets lively at the cost of others, but imagine that you have just a city where the difference between better streets and poor streets is smaller, right? So we're going to just try to create streets that are all equipped to have people. So with infrastructure, with sidewalks, with trees, with certain sort of attributes of the built environment that people find attractive so that they can be walkable. So it doesn't mean that I'm going to move. Of course, like if more people are attracted to those places, more people will visit them. Sure. But the point is to close the gap between the streets that are very, very attractive and those that no one visits. Because so that's sort of the leverage is in the built environment, not moving people per se.
And the general the people, they are the residents of the city, or they are
to answer your first question, so yes. So the GPS data is collected using smartphone applications of people walking, and we filter based on the frequency of pings across a whole year to sort of focus on residents. But we could, so in the original sample, it included people that were 1 day in Boston in a year or 2 days in a year. those you could include as well. But the results are mostly focused on residents, so people that ping frequently throughout different days throughout all the year.
Okay. And the last question is regarding the data collection using the LiDARs, because when you have the high-rising buildings, so you said that there was a company and just saw a photo and they just take the data. Why not you use the drone imaging or photography for collecting the LiDAR data?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it also lets me speak a little bit about the context of data collection in different places. So, and about the sort of biases or perceptions of safety that we attach to different data sources. So for example, when we started working in Brazil, my initial reaction was exactly yours. Why can't we just fly a drone or collect it with Google Street View, or just ask the people? If we, isn't it like easier to just do a survey? So for the first answer to your drone question, it's really that the favela is so dense that drone image does not distinguish buildings. Like the 3D morphology of it is just impenetrable from the satellite or airborne view. So that's okay, we can't do drone. All right, let's go to street view. And the point here is that people are very, very skeptical about images. So it's incredible because LiDAR is also an image, right? But you know, these are the interesting things about context and why you also have to sort of embed yourself in it. The residents were not comfortable with people taking pictures or cameras walking around. And so we ditched that as a solution, right? Because part of the goal of the project was also to sort of work with the community there to collect the data, and they weren't comfortable with images, so images was not an option either. So yeah, that's why we ended up using LiDAR data, which honestly is great because it also allows us to sort of measure the 3D dimension of the favela, which I think is a very interesting angle in itself. But yeah, that's the long story of why.
Yeah, I noticed that on the weekend, actually, I was on the Venus, and I noticed that some points, the street density is so, there's so much dense that even you can't follow the map because the dots are so difficult to follow. So exactly. This may be the reason that you are pointing out. Thank you so much. Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next one up is Mike Tam.
Yep. Oh, okay. You can hear me from there. Well, I have some. Well, first of all, thank you very much. It was very interesting, and of course, you are raising a lot of very interesting, very important research questions. I have. Should I do just the first topic or yes, both first and second?
Let's do the first topic and then.
Okay. I will come back with the second. It is more light than in a sense. Concerning the first one, I have a couple of one thing I'm sort of concerned about the way you analyze the data. Is that you sort of seem to presume that the attractiveness of a street is a function of what is on the street. But I think it might be, and I think it is actually quite true often, that people like to be where other people are. So you might have the effect, which is basically like, you know, ants following the same route because other ants were working on the same route. Even if all streets are exactly the same, people would tend to take a favorite one. That is one thing. And another thing, I'm not sure that it is actually a good idea that all streets will be equally attractive. Both generally, I mean, different people like different things, and it is good to have variety. And more practically, well, from my experience in Moscow, for example, just next to my home, there are two old streets. One of them will be way more attractive according to your metrics. It is always full of people. It is full of bars and restaurants and stuff like this. And another one is much more going essentially in parallel and much more secluded and with much less people. Although, well, number one thing is that people who are actually living in the street, which is crowded like up to 3 hours in the morning, are not exactly very happy about that. And basically, it is one sort of an issue. Another sort of an issue is that, well, as a person living there, you sometimes want one thing, sometimes want another thing.
So for sure, I agree with your point.
That's basically all I
Not
wanted
all
to say.
streets. So let me start by the end, which is like, of course, not all streets will be equally attractive, and even attractiveness varies a lot from person to person, right? Like this measure is sort of the average of all of us, and all of us are very, very different, right? So that's the first thing, and then the second thing is like, I think you're touching on the policy side of like, okay, what do we want to do now that we know that this street has like a low desirability? But that's sort of a different question, and I think orthogonal to the motivation of the paper, which was just to understand why. Like, why is it? Like, what are the built environment attributes contributing to why we see so many people? And if they are, which are they? That's sort of the premise of the paper, which is sort of independent of like what we want to do with it afterwards, right? Yeah, and then for your first point, which is for sure, there's a part of desirability that is the built environment, which is what I tried to argue. But of course, there's another part that is a bunch of things. It's just the amount of people that are there. It's just that maybe you have closer streets that also attract more, and so you end up attracting even more people. So that is definitely true. And that's in fact what we document, right? The built environment represents an important, but it's not all of the explanation of the activity. In other words, I can't just take the number of businesses, the presence of sidewalks, the presence of trees, come up with a measure of urban design and predict the number of people that will come. That's not true. It predicts only, let's say, 10% of that activity, which is not to say it's zero, right? It's meaningful. We have valuable information from the built environment, but there are, of course, other social dynamics in place that are also sort of contributing to the desirability of a place. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and actually, what trying to sort of turn my question in a more practical way, I think it might make sense to try and figure out what are to go beyond averages in a sense, to try to figure out what are the different patterns of how people are using streets, and maybe what is contributing to attractiveness for in these different modes, so to speak.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, honestly, that would require a lot more data, which we don't have, because even if you think you hear like GPS data and that sounds humongous, it's actually not that much, right? Because imagine it's like people walking every day, but people in general take many different routes. So it's almost like, and you don't have the characteristics of those people. So it's almost like we're taking, I think, to the limit what we can learn from this data. But of course, like if we acquire more data or data that will allow us to know a little bit more about who you are, then we can for sure do a better job at that.
So, Mark, is your question also regarding Project One?
Also, but it connects with Mike's question actually.
Can I chime into where we just arrived regarding Project One?
Yeah.
So I think there's an interesting thing regarding this limit thing. I think it's very interesting that you use Boston as the example. Like Boston is like sort of the low-hanging fruit and desirable city on which you want to do this, because Manhattan, Brooklyn is sort of it blows up in your in your lab because like there's like too much stuff happening. And so now one of the interesting things about the United States is there's not that many places that are actually walkable. I mean, you can literally like counted on 10 fingers. And other than Boston, there's maybe parts of Chicago and maybe San Francisco. And then basically that's it. And so then if you look at these special places, not only, as you said, there may not be that much data, but it's also rather particular, right? The one example you showed is a 2.5-hour walk. Who takes a 2.5-hour walk? At that point, it doesn't really matter if you walk for 2 hours or 2.5 hours. This is definitely not a work commute. This is not a regular pedestrian. It's somebody who says, I take a walk. And somebody who says, I take a walk wants to take a beautiful walk. And now there is this thing that Boston is really particular. Like it's not like Manhattan where you can take any street and it's interesting, but you want to have shops, you walk down Newbury Street. You want to have trees, you take one street down, and that's it. There's like two options. And then there's nothing else. And so the key question is, how much can you actually take that and actually transplant it to other things? And there, I want to, regarding applicability, I want to hear you comment what you said. You said people really like streets where there's a homogeneous building picture. So I lived 8 years in Texas. That's basically what every suburban neighborhood looks like. It's a homogeneous design of supposed walkability where everybody rides a car, nobody walks. And so the key question is, in how far is what you're studying here applicable to Boston itself, but really doesn't work whatsoever in the United States more broadly?
Yeah, I think you have a great point of like, we're talking about cities where people do walk, right? Of course, yes. Like the decision of whether to walk or take a car, of course, is a blind spot of our data. We don't have sort of mode switching or any of that. So we're for sure missing people that in Texas or in the majority of America take a car for a 5-minute trip, which is, as you well highlighted, the majority of the United States. But to your point, I think it's very interesting to sort of expand these results to different cities. So we validated also the results in San Francisco, where we also have GPS data. We would love also to do it in Europe, but unfortunately accessing this type of data is difficult. So we're constantly like trying to get our hands on it, but it's not very easy. So yeah, I mean, it's an open question of whether like we find consistent results in San Francisco, but it's a sort of an open question of like how sort of the external validity, right? Like how applicable or consistent are all results in different contexts.
That is interesting here. So basically you say where people already walk, you can make it better. And we have still no solution for like the 95% of all Americans.
Yes.
Well, but basically in that case, you need globally to redesign cities. There are distances are so such that it is impossible to resolve without global redesigns.
My favorite anecdote is the Telluride, which is a tiny ski town, is one of the most walkable places in the US, which is sort of ironic. Mark Metz.
Yeah, oh, thank you. It was really interesting, really sort of geographic information, really far from what I'm doing, but was still interesting. Yeah, so if you were talking about like external validity, then so I do wonder that, well, how generalizable it is. I mean, it would be really interesting to see that how it expands on the other cities. So because so which was kind of what Mike mentioned also, that well, like how people like perceive their environment, right? So the really different reasons of like why they take different paths. But it's like I guess it's not only that people have different motivations, different things they like from the environment, but also that the way they perceive the environment is different. That what some people think is homogeneous, it might not be like that at all by others, and it might perhaps really differ by cities. So I'm curious to see if there will be like totally opposite like results in that sense, if you know what I mean. And like in connection to that well, I'm just bringing forth some qualitative aspect, I think, and in connection to that, he's like this contrasting your findings with sort of inputs from some residents themselves. Is it part of your research? Like, do you feel it is part of it, or do you think that you're providing an input that some other research can later like add this layer? How do you see it?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think at this point we've been mostly focused on GPS, but that's not to say that I'm not open to, of course, collaborating and like mixing different data sources. So for example, I don't know if you've heard of Jangel. All of his practice is sort of trying to understand public spaces or street use using surveys, or even like static cameras or things like that. And so to see how people come together, how long they stay, which links a little bit to Paris flows and methodologically. So yeah, right now we're mostly focused on GPS data, but for sure there are things that it misses. So it'll always be better to sort of combine different data sources. And to your first point about different cities, I mean, I agree with you. It would be interesting to sort of expand it to other places. We've done it in San Francisco, as I mentioned before, and we find consistent results. But of course, it's still an open question of how much this is sort of a universal pattern, right?
Thank you very much. Mila, sorry? You want to answer? Sorry. Mila Oiva is the next up.
I was just going to say, I forgot something, Mark. I was going to also say something about ways that we can expand this without needing GPS data, because as I mentioned before, it's so difficult to get our hands on it. We're also working on ways to sort of use crowdsourced data to basically build a pedestrian model, right? That can predict where people will go based on more easily accessible data. So that's sort of one of the avenues that we're also working on. And our GPS data in that area would serve as sort of a calibrate the model.
So people would submit themselves their like pathways.
People will.
Because I've seen a sort of this kind of tool in research. They were doing city planning in Estonia, and they were doing a city planning in Estonia. They're basically planning new bicycle and bus routes, like changing like all of the city transport system. And part of it was just basically crowdsourcing and asking people to put down your main route that you transit like within the day. So this is like really, I guess, crowdsourcing to find like
Yep.
this.
Yep,
Yeah.
that's one way. Exactly. But you can also try and predict, which is what we're trying to do. I mean, you can mix it with surveys or other ways of recording where people go, but you can also just use like information about the street network, information about the buildings, like which we know predict well, not entirely, not 100%, but pretty well where people go. And so you can try to use all of that plus the GPS data to construct a model of where people go.
So this is an interesting thing. You go back to, like, at the same time, you know, GPS, you get away from the good old charrette and, you know, chain takeoffs, asking people on the street corner, and now you're back. And so is there something that we can learn from this older literature where we could now say, okay, now we've done 10-year GPS, cell phone, CDR studies, smartphones, but we have to actually go back and do the old stuff. Is there cutoff points, or?
I mean, for me, I think it's more, we're learning different things, different dimensions, right? So it links back to sort of the first question on, for example, gender. Like, we know gender is an important thing on how we navigate cities, right? There are tangible differences. And so if we know that, GPS without gender information will miss that. Mm-hmm. So as far as we can incorporate that knowledge via survey, via observation, via any other way, we're going to be better off. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's just a matter of like the type of question that we want to answer understanding the limits of the data we are using, and if possible, combining different data sources to sort of get a more comprehensive picture. But of course, that's difficult, and right, it depends on one project to another, but that would be sort of the gold standard.
Yes. Mila.
Yeah, this actually ties really nicely to my question, because I wanted to hear a little bit more about how do you get people to be involved in your research, and kind of like with, especially with this applicability, which I think is really fascinating in all of your projects. Kind of like, maybe for the background for this question is that I'm a historian, and I have been working, for instance, studying like fake history circulating online in Russian World Wide Web, and simultaneously I'm a member of an association in which we try to prevent political uses of history. And the past couple of weeks have shown that our work has miserably failed, at least in Europe. So just to kind of like to if you have some examples on kind of like how to involve people in different kinds of projects would be really nice. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So I think your question is very important and also very difficult because it changes from context to context. And like throughout my time at Sensible City, this has taken many different forms of how we collaborate with people, right? So, but usually I would say like for projects to have an impact, a key critical part is local partnerships. So for example, in RATP, that means a local transport operator that knows the ground very well, and also that has sort of a set of key problems that they're interested in resolving, or that are sort of, hotspots of like things that they want to see improved. So that's the first thing. But also there's like different and less tangible and important alliances that happen. So for example, in the Favelas project, where it's more about how we partner. In this case, we partner with so the city planning sort of mayor was our local partner in the ground. And really his partnership was crucial, right? Because how we link to the community, how we allow that facilitated the data collection, right? It would have been impossible for us to just land in Rio and acquire the LiDAR data if it weren't because there were previous conversations and like an agreement of how we would do this. And I also wanted to say that like it's really difficult in general, in my opinion, to sort of have both, right? Which is sort of, I think, an advantage of Sensible City, which is like we do the research and we want to publish papers, but also like engagement and like producing things that are actionable are also equally important. And so that's also like something that I wanted to say, that we usually and try to pursue that. It's not always successful. Some things you just, you can't do it, but that's sort of the goal.
So there's an example also, the relation between these two things is interesting, I think, right? So on the one hand, you engage partners like the bus company in Paris Flow, and then the other thing you bring to the table is the analysis, which in this case, what is the importance? Like how important is the bus company? How important is, for example, the development of the sensor, which in this case, assume is something like NVIDIA Jetson really basic machine vision in a nice package, which you can just strap to the windshield. So it seems in this particular case that the relationship building with the actual partner is way more important than the actual sort of like development of the sensor, isn't it?
Absolutely. Like the sensor was like the easiest thing we could do, right? Like you can place it in any, like the difficult part, honestly, was the privacy compliancy. So making a sensor that doesn't store any images so that it's GDPR compliant. So that's where the interesting sort of technical challenge was. But you can't imagine this project coming about without a partner on the ground that would allow us to install that sensor in the bus in the first place, right? So that's how important the partnership was, for sure.
So you spend more time talking to the partner than actually building the sensor in a sense, right? Isn't it?
I mean, I think there's also many other things that are beyond the sensor, like all the analytics,
yeah.
right? But yeah, for sure. Like I think the partnerships are very, very important, and the types of partners also dictate sort of the types of projects that we end up doing, right? So yeah, there are so for example, in the Paris project, it was more like an interest on managing curbs and understanding street use. And so we pivoted that into that project.
Super interesting. Do you mind if I take Xenia first, or do you want to go next?
Well, whatever.
Xenia, okay.
We have time.
Yeah, I have a small question about Paris Flow project. But first of all, thank you for the amazing talk. This is really inspiring. And I noticed that you had your project in Paris run in May 2021. And I checked that they had a lockdown right before that, and it ended in April. So I assume that probably there was some influence in that, so people maybe not gathered together that much and had social distancing, and maybe that's the reason why they didn't stay on the streets. So I wanted to ask, maybe you have some comments on that, or maybe you have plans in the future to repeat this experiment to compare the data.
Yeah, thank you. So great. Yep, that you're totally right. It was after the lockdown, Paris was just starting to sort of reset. And we definitely plan to follow up in Paris, but also in other cities. So our ATP has a sort of a big network of buses beyond Paris. So this was sort of the proof of concept. And our goal would be to expand it, hopefully to all of Paris and many other cities as well. So yeah, I wouldn't take, like, I don't think even a month is enough, even if COVID was not there, you know, like we would want also like more time. But it was sort of an interesting sort of proof of concept of like, okay, can this be done? What type of information do we get? And how could the city make it useful for them? So yeah.
I have one follow-up question which is, this is an obvious opportunity. You know, people like Marta Gonzalez build careers on this. Like, if you would actually say, okay, beyond my PhD, which just totally gives me one of the 3 papers as a concept, I run with this professorship at Sorbonne, 6 years. I tell you everything about Paris pedestrian movement based on this bus data. Like, this is perfectly imaginable. But obviously, like the hiring committee say, like I'm making this up, of course, the hiring committee would say, okay, what's your big idea? What do we learn in 6 years when you do this? Like, what is beyond like, okay, here's like people eat baguette over there and they dance in the street over here and people take a smoke outside Galerie Lafayette. Like, what do we really learn? What do we know in 6 years that we cannot anticipate right now?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And it touches to sort of, I think, the central planning theories. So for example, like central place theory, which explains like why we gather and why there's always like subcenters, sort of a fractal configuration of cities, right? And so understanding at this granularity how streets work could inform such theories. Or recently, I don't know if you're familiar with like visitation law. So which relates to the central place theory as well. So it's basically like all this information about human behavior. The hope is that we will understand better just like how cities form, right? And how they, like the inner workings of them based on how people move. Yeah, so I think that's sort of that's the goal.
Thank you very much.
I have a question? Can I have an interesting, like something that fascinates me? Maybe not. Yeah, thank you, Arianna. Was really cool. I'm very fascinated, maybe not about the movement of people, but why they're stationary sometimes. And that's so I had a conversation with the owner of a hobby store here in Tallinn, and I was asking him why doesn't he want to move closer to where our office is, because that would be really convenient for me. I would not have to go to the other part of the city. And I told him there was another hobby store there. Why wouldn't you just occupy the same place? Because like everything is done for it. And he said, and for the context, this is one of the busiest streets, and it's a very walkable street also. I mean, maybe not very comfortable walkable, but there are sidewalks and lots of people cross it. But there is one problem, they never stand there. And he said, I would never build or like start a shop where people never stop. So, and that's probably my question is, how do we mass study people who don't move?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's super interesting. I actually haven't done work on like stationary people, why people stay in place, but I think there's a lot of interesting work on like natural disasters or things or like external shocks that you would think people would move, right? Because they're like under substantial threat and they don't, right? And this has related to like social ties or like the fact that you were born there and you just like feel like this is where you're from. So it can be sort of also like a geographical attachment to the place. Like there are many social reasons why people don't move, but for sure they also create a lot of sort of inefficiencies, right? Like I think, I'll give you an example. Like I feel like in Latin America, when you study commute, and this is not stationary, but just like how people move from one place to another, people are used to living very far away from your work. So you live maybe 1 hour, 1 hour and a half commute away from where you work. And I think that's sort of touching or reaching a critical point because 5 years ago, that commute was 20 minutes, right? And because of traffic, it's becoming unbearable. So I think we're also going to foresee sort of a movement or reshuffling of where people work and live based on sort of just the commute being unmanageable, because people are spending lots and lots of more time traveling instead of like enjoying themselves.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's a very interesting point about why people don't move.
Just also I think the methods and the ways we visualize the data is more adapted towards some things that change over time and evolve, but we might oversee people who just stand there forever and what is important for them then.
Agreed. Yeah.
There's a great Werner Herzog movie which involves almost volcanic eruption on an island. There's one person left, which I highly recommend in this circumstance. Mike has the next question.
Yeah, well, actually, I have numerous questions and comments.
Numerous, whoa!
Concerning the Parisian part as a former resident of the city. Well, first of all, it's cool. And it is clear that it has huge potential, and then this thing with the buses, it really is impressive. But I have several comments. Comment number one is that, of course, I don't think that it is a big problem, but you just shouldn't say that. This bus route is definitely not representative of Paris. It is essentially going around what I would, to most extent, call more posh and boring part of the city. Yeah. Second thing, actually, when you mentioned this map of pedestrianized city quarters with different colors. I don't know, probably you just admitted that, but it is interesting to notice that your bus route goes exactly around the part of the city which has no this colored districts which were pedestrianized in the last 10 years.
Yeah, maybe I can say something about the first two, and then you can continue
with
the list. So yeah, so maybe I misspoke. I didn't mean that it was representative of Paris city. I just meant it was the line.
It's quite variable indeed. Yes, it has different things, but it is.
Exactly. So that was what we were optimizing. It was like, how can we use one line to measure as many like diverse built environments and that is long enough so that we can measure them, right? Because usually the bus lines are shorter, and we actually measured like constructed sort of typologies of built environments just based on the physical aspects of them. And that's how we decided on this line. So it actually does trisect like the majority of different built environments. So what I mean by that is, I mean, residential, commercial areas, hubs of transportation, all of these like different types. It's the line that crosses the most varied ones. So that's sort of our criteria. I agree with you. It's not representative of the whole Paris. Like we would have to do all Paris, I think, to be comfortable saying that. And then your second point about the line, it crosses, I think it's only 5 of those. So, and here I left this, so I'm glad that you opened it up because I wanted to sort of speak a little bit more about this project, which is just starting now. So the idea of that is to combine the data that we collected in the buses, which is only available for around 5 of these zones, with social media data. So in this case, we are using Twitter data that is available on all of them and also across time, because as you might also imagine, this data that we have is only 2021 and the staggered policies go back in time. So we need historical data. And so we're using Twitter data and using our bus data as sort of a ground truthing for the Twitter. So that's sort of how that would work. And for the Twitter data, we're constructing measures of, you can think of it as just like a density of people that visit these locations, and also sort of a integration measure based on where a user tweets, and then we aggregate them to the neighborhood level. So it's basically like how each one of these zones pulls together people from different neighborhoods inferred from Twitter data. So that's sort of where that project is. So it's more like a mix of different data sources to study human activity.
And to continue, can you show once again what was your results for standing and moving pedestrians in different places?
What? Let me share my screen. Wait, here?
No,
Not sure
I think there was, this one. Number one, what is the unit of measurement?
Hour. Number.
Yeah, so it's average number of cars, let's say, per 100 meters.
Okay, but here's the question concerning, mostly pedestrians, not cars. For example, you have, two places you discussed extensively is Place Saint-Michel and Place Saint-Sulpice. Place Saint-Michel is a crowded area where essentially there is intersection of 3 roads and rather narrow sidewalks along them. And Place Saint-Sulpice is quite a large place, and I imagine that bus is going, and on the right there is like 100 meters of space, which is essentially 100 meters wide up to the church. So it seems like the natural measurement is number of people per square meter, not per meter of the road, because you have quite different distance, and the natural question is how deep your sensor is working to the side, is looking to the side. Well, that will be the first one. Maybe I will have a second one.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, there are different ways of normalizing the measure. We just thought that per 100 meters was the easiest to convert from the image itself. But yeah, I mean, there are many ways that we can construct sort of a density.
But for example, if you're looking at central piece, you are looking at the people who are walking along the road, or you are looking at the people deep inside the square as well?
I think so. Let me see if I have a picture that shows you. I don't think I have
basically
one
what's on your
here.
picture, right?
So yeah, so you can tell, but I think I don't have one with me here, but you can tell, which I honestly was surprised about how detailed you can capture an object. So basically until the end of the image, you're able to classify an activity or a car. And so imagine, so the camera is installed in the front, but it's a wide angle. So you get all of the side. So it's like, and a little bit also of the front. So I think you can get all the
So you get as deep as the next building, essentially.
That is correct.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And the second question, because I'm quite surprised, for example, well, this sort of explains why you see more people on Central Piece than on Saint Michel, because for any person familiar with the place, Saint Michel is way more crowded.
Crowded, yep.
Yeah, but if it is much deeper than aggregating. Yes, but another thing I'm a little bit surprised is this random fluctuations of the crowding of Saint Michel from hour to hour. And my question is basically how you validate that because you're told that you don't collect any images and your sensor does the recognition itself, and you seem to have no records to compare and to check that it have done it correctly. So how this problem?
Yeah. So right now we're just looking at sort of the accuracy of the model. So you can actually see the picture, right? And then see how many people are there, and then see how many people the model missed or misclassified. And so that's the metric we have. So in general, there is really no like standard threshold to say like, okay, this accuracy for this context is sort of the state of the art. But in general, I think when you achieve more than 70% accuracy, people feel comfortable that you're doing a good job. And in most of the cases, we achieve above 80% accuracy. So that means that we're sort of classifying most of the activities well. So that's sort of how we're validating the classification of the model. Of course, you can also imagine that you can have paired with a future deployment, someone actually counting on the fly. But I think that's, I mean, given that you have pictures for a subset, you can also use that and not have a person counting.
I have a question, like precise question regarding the 100 meters. Is this 100 meters, like, do you take a sample every 100 meters of movement, or how would one imagine that?
Yeah, no, we take a sample every 3 seconds.
Okay.
Yeah, and we average them all out. So that's sort of the average count for every 100 meters.
Okay. Yeah, and I have one more question. What is the time distance between the buses, and how well they are, how good they are following the schedule? I mean,
not good. Yeah, so I don't want to.
I mean, because so you don't have it.
You can tell me, are they good or are they not? No, right? So I learned something interesting about how buses function, which I didn't know before. That is that in Paris, you don't assign a specific bus to a bus line. So this was an interesting challenge because we were only installing the sensor in one bus, but there was no way to guarantee that that bus was going to go through the line 70. So every day you have a set of buses and they randomly go out. Also because a lot of buses break down or things happen. And so they just have like a constant flow of buses and assign them on the fly to each route, which I thought was surprising. But in general, I don't think that they follow a very fixed schedule. Of course, there's like bunching and like delaying of buses all the time. The only thing that we had was like a consistent, like we just have the sensor and it goes back and forth along the same line. Yeah.
Nice. Anybody else? Everybody's happy. Nice. So maybe you can talk a little bit about this relation to, you mentioned this new model that came out and the law of visitation and a central place theory. Like, how does this at Sensible City Lab influence like all the other projects that have to do with geospatial? Because this was a pretty big paper, and sort of for those who haven't read the paper, it's about like it's about how many people have been at a place before, which is how attractive it is, which is related to this old school thing called central place theory by Kristaller, who happened to be the geographic planner of Adolf Hitler in Eastern Europe. So there is a relation to what's happening right now, which is also quite tragic. So how does this influence the way you're operating? Is this something you then try to find in your data, or is it completely different?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in some cases it does, like you're trying to sort of validate some of the findings that were true in other papers using different data sources. Mm-hmm. But in general, I would say that the efforts happen in parallel. And that happens also just because of the nature of how the lab works and the number of people that are working currently. So a lot of people are physically at the lab, but many are abroad. And so I'll give you an example. So there's another paper that is called The Pointiest Path, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but it's about, so typically, as I said, the benchmark model is the shortest path, which is usually what we use. So everything that you deviate from the shortest path is sort of meaningful. And the reason is because we think that humans just optimize on going the shortest route when they go from point A to B. That's sort of the benchmark model of how humans move. And the pointiest path is sort of I guess like an enhancement of that model that takes into account direction and angles. So basically it's not only about the shortest path, but it's also being like the leanest path in a sense. And so that project happened, I would say even like it started even before Desirable Streets, just like, so it's like they were moving in parallel, but they had different angles, right? One was more structural about coming up with a model of how people behave and move, while Desirable Streets was sort of the empirical angle to that. Okay, given that we move this way, or what do deviations from that benchmark model tell us about the built environment? So it's almost like things happen in parallel, but for sure, like when the vegetation paper came out, then there was like a push to try and understand sort of using GPS data, if we could sort of find some universality of those patterns. So yeah, and there's like other projects, like for example, that take that insight and try to study the spread of disease. So there's almost like a cross-pollination every time like an idea comes out. We definitely try to also explore that idea in different contexts and using different data. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much. So, yes, there's one question, Mark Hannett, sorry.
Hello. Yeah, I'm doing practice-based PhD, and means actually some of the things that you do is quite interesting because you are very practical. You do some, I mean, I'm doing art projects, and I'm studying with artificial intelligence how to get out different ways the navigation, the latent space on the AI models, basically using what has learned the AI models to build interactive art projects in plane. I want to ask you more about how you frame and how you do the design. I see, for example, this Favelas 4D. On the credits, you have a project and design manager, and you are the lead of the project. Means whenever you have like an idea of a project, I don't know. I had learned, I just come from Hong Kong University of Science and Technology from doing a stage. And I know the top universities has more resources than other universities. And I see your credits and I just want that you understand. I mean, I'm a PhD student. I understand that you are also a PhD student. And I want to understand if you have an idea, how you are able to realize it. I mean, you just pitch to your director of the lab and then he fund the whole project, or you need to find some grant. I mean, I have the thing that here I'm struggling like to fund the art projects. Basically, I need to fund in the normal way. Like I'm an artist, practicing artist. I found the art center who funds some money, and then I do. I just need to know how. I mean, I'm just very curious to know how in MIT is done. I know that MIT has a huge endowment and that is a very rich university. But I know sometimes, and I know from Hong Kong that sometimes they always talk about they have millions, but at the end
Nobody
of the day,
sees them.
At the end of the day, yeah, no one sees. They pay good to their staff, but then maybe when you ask for a Raspberry Pi, it's difficult to get it. I mean, that's just like.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for that question. I think that changes a lot from project to project and from lab to lab and from PI to PI. Like really, there is no standard way. Even within Sensible, we have projects that are partner funded. For example, RATP in Paris. It is sort of a collaboration, and it's a long time collaboration with sort of an agency or a partner that is part of the consortium, which is usually like a partnership that is like at a minimum, I think 2 years. So that's sort of long-term funding, right? But then there are other projects, which is, for example, Favelas 4D. That is a project that is not funded by an external entity. It's more like we are putting the resources and then to try and get funding to do it in a bigger scale. All right. So it almost happened like at a very small scale because of that, right? If we had the funds, we would have scanned the whole favela at once. And so we did sort of a proof of concept. We put it out there as a methodology that could hopefully spark the interest of other people. And then our hope is to get funding to do it in both in Rocinha at the full scale and also in other cities. Desirable Streets, it's entirely different. It's no funding. So it's actually just a research idea that you propose to the PI and you execute it with, yeah. So I literally showed 3 projects that the funding model are 3 different things. And I'm sure if you speak to another person, they will tell you other 3 different ways. So yeah, long story short, it's very different and it varies project to project.
Yeah, I think one should say that Carlo Ratti's initiatives, not only Sensible City Lab at MIT, but more broadly, the whole Sensible enterprise is a success disaster in terms of like how much funding it has acquired over the last 15 years. And one would find many, many models, as you say, but it's also really exceptional. So the question is really not how is it done at MIT, but like how is it done? How does
Carlo do it?
Because like even at MIT, everybody is looking enviously at Carlo, right?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So it's more like yeah, how does Carlo do it? I think that's why I said like it varies a lot from lab to lab, even within MIT, right? There are very small labs with 2 people, or there are in computer science or engineering. It's more like big corporate, like Siemens funds you and there are 50 people working on the same thing. So like it changes a lot. But I think I think Sensible's model is so nice also because of the freedom that it provides. So, right, because it's at the end, it's successful in acquiring funds, but it's also successful in like the academic liberty that people have to think about different ideas. So I'm not at Sensible funded by like one thing and only doing that thing, right? Like it's almost like you go in and it's a world of like different opportunities and different like spin-offs of projects. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about it.
Thank you very much. So what we're doing here is called academic mixing, and Sensible City Lab is one of the 3-4 examples I'm constantly mentioning as an example of where this really happens and has been super successful over time. And you gave us a really, really great impression about this today. We started an hour late.
Sorry.
No problem. But as there is no other questions arising, I would say let's call it a day. We're very happy. We're very fascinated by your work, and so this was super inspiring. And we hope to meet in the future. Also, friends at the Sensible City Lab and so on. And obviously, if you pass by Tallinn, you're very welcome to hang out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I hope you learned something interesting about cities, and let's stay in touch for sure.
Yes, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.